I'm going to tell you about a place that doesn't officially exist. A testing range in Kazakhstan in 1961, where I worked as a launch protocol officer. The job title sounds more impressive than it was. Really, I was a message carrier, a messenger between the control room and the launch pad. I walked those corridors every single day for 2 years. I saw things that were never supposed to leave that facility, and I followed rules. Rules that saved my life. Rules that I only understood years later, when I read declassified documents and realized what had actually happened there. My name is irrelevant now. The Soviet Union that built that facility is gone. The scientists who developed the protocols are dead, but the rules they created are still burned into my memory with the clarity of trauma. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. Not speculation, not conspiracy theories, just what I saw, just what I learned, just the protocol. I was recruited into the space program at 23 years old. I had a background in mathematics and military service. The recruiter showed up at my apartment in Moscow without warning. 2 men in dark coats. They didn't ask if I was interested. They asked if I was available. I said yes before I understood the question. That's how the program worked in 1961. You didn't apply, you were selected, and you didn't ask questions. The facility was called Baikonur Cosmodrome, though we never called it that. We called it the Range. It was built in the Kazakhstan desert, roughly 1,200 kilometers east of the Caspian Sea. Remote, isolated, perfect for something you wanted to keep hidden from the world. The first time I arrived, I was flown in at night, military transport plane. No windows, no explanations. When I stepped out, the desert was so black it looked like we'd landed in another dimension. They gave me a uniform, a pass, a small room in the residential compound, and then they gave me the manual. It was a thin book, maybe 80 pages, stamped classified in red on every other page. The first section covered basic protocols for launch procedures, standard stuff, emergency exits, fire suppression, radio procedures. But then there was Section 4, and that's when things got strange. Section 4 was titled Contingency Procedures for Launch Failures and Associated Phenomena. The wording was careful, bureaucratic, almost like they were trying to hide the real meaning inside the official terminology. I read it 3 times that first night and didn't sleep. The section contained 6 rules, 6 specific protocols that all launch officers had to memorize and follow without exception. They were printed on a laminated card that I had to carry with me at all times. I still remember the way those words looked, the typeface, the exact spacing, because I read them so many times that they burned into the back of my retinas. Rule 1. If a launch fails on the pad, initiate evacuation immediately. Do not wait for official confirmation. The moment you hear the alarm, move to the shelter. Do not acknowledge orders to remain at your station. This was unusual. We were trained to follow commands, but this rule explicitly told us to disobey. That's when I realized these protocols weren't about standard procedures. They were about something else, something they anticipated but couldn't quite explain. Rule 2. During evacuation, never look back at the launch tower. This sounds almost poetic, like something from Greek mythology, but the manual was very specific. Eyes forward, eyes down, never back at the facility. They even specified that looking back would result in disorientation, vestibular confusion, and potential cognitive failure. Military jargon, but what they meant was, looking back would make your brain stop working correctly. Rule 3. If you hear your name called from the observation deck during evacuation, do not respond. Do not pause. Do not acknowledge it. Continue moving to the shelter. Stay with your group. Do not deviate from the designated path. I remember thinking about this one a lot. Why would our names be called? Who would be calling them? The rule implied that something or someone would try to distract us during an emergency. The manual didn't explain why. It just said it would happen and that we had to ignore it. Rule 4. Between 11 p.m. and dawn, do not enter any maintenance tunnels alone. Always go in pairs. Always maintain visual contact with your partner. Always keep your radio on. Always report your location every 10 minutes. And this one was the strangest. Always count the doors. Count them as you pass them. The manual said, discrepancies in door count may indicate structural changes or spatial inconsistencies. Report any anomalies immediately. Structural changes? In a tunnel? That didn't make sense. Concrete doesn't change overnight, but the rule was there, and the emphasis was undeniable. Rule 5. If the launch is postponed due to unexplained instrument failure, do not approach the rocket. Do not attempt to repair anything. In fact, do not go near the launch pad at all for a minimum of 6 hours. Instead, report to the barracks. Remain inside. Do not look out the windows. Limit communication to essential radio traffic only. Stay inside until officially released. The manual used air quotes around unexplained instrument failure. I'm being literal about this. There were actual quotation marks in the printed text, which meant there was something happening with the rockets that wasn't being explained as instrument failure at all. Rule 6. If you encounter anyone in restricted areas who should not be there, do not confront them. Do not call security. Simply leave the area quietly and report it through your supervisor. Do not use the radio. Do not write it down. Tell your supervisor verbally and never mention it again. This implied that there were people in places they shouldn't be, people who weren't supposed to be found, people who might be dangerous if confronted. I spent 2 years wondering who those people were. The manual ended with a single sentence that stayed with me for decades. These protocols are implemented for everyone's safety, including those who cannot be accounted for in official records. Those who cannot be accounted for. I read that over and over. What it meant, I had no idea. I started my assignment on March 3, 1961. The Soviet space program was accelerating. We all knew that the Americans were pushing hard to be first into space. The pressure was immense. The entire facility hummed with urgency. There was no casual conversation. Everyone moved with purpose. Everyone looked tired. We were aware on some level that we were part of something historic. What we didn't know was that we were also part of something else, something that history wouldn't record. My role was simple enough at first. I carried messages between the control room and various stations around the facility. I delivered updated schedules. I collected data sheets. I transported documentation from one sector to another. Basic courier work, which meant I had access to many areas of the complex, which meant I saw things, inconsistencies, oddities that didn't fit into the official narrative.
The first time I really understood that something was wrong was on April 12, 1961, but not because of what happened that day, because of what happened the night before. I was in the observation corridor around 10 p.m., delivering updated countdown statistics to the control room. The rocket, A modified R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile was scheduled for launch the following morning. This was a test flight, our first test of the new guidance system. It was going to carry a dummy payload, or so we were told. I suspected it was carrying more than that. The security presence was too intense, too many generals, too many cameras. As I was walking through the equipment section, I noticed something odd. There was a maintenance tunnel access panel that was open. These panels were always sealed, always. I'd never seen one open before. And standing in front of it, partially illuminated by the red glow of the industrial lighting, was a man I didn't recognize. He wasn't wearing a standard uniform. His clothes looked older. The fabric had a quality I couldn't quite place, and he was just standing there, staring into the tunnel, not moving, not doing anything, just standing and staring. I remembered Rule 6 immediately. Do not confront. Do not call security. Leave quietly and report through your supervisor. So I did. I turned around and walked back the way I came. My heart was pounding. I didn't report it that night. I don't know why. I told myself I would report it the next day. But that night, everything changed. The launch happened at 9:07 a.m. on April 12th. I was in the control room when it went live. The rocket lifted off perfectly, flawlessly. I watched the monitors as the vehicle climbed, the telemetry data streaming across the screens in real time. Everything nominal, everything on track. And then, at 108 minutes into the flight, something went wrong. The signal went dead, just stopped. One moment we had data, the next moment we had nothing. The entire room went silent. The controllers leaned forward. They were checking instruments, recalibrating, looking for the source of the signal loss. And then we heard it. A voice on the radio. A transmission from the capsule. Except it wasn't from the capsule. It came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active. A frequency that predated the capsule's communication system by several minutes.
The voice was faint, distorted, but it was definitely a human voice. And it was saying the same thing over and over. I'm coming back. I'm coming back down. I'm coming back. I'm coming back down. The chief controller immediately ordered a radio blackout. No one was allowed to communicate. No one was allowed to acknowledge what we'd heard. He then received a phone call, probably from the highest level. He listened for 30 seconds. He said yes 3 times, and then he ordered an immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel from the facility. That's when I remembered Rule 1. If a launch fails on the pad, initiate evacuation immediately. But this wasn't on the pad. This was in orbit. There was no pad to fail, but the protocol was clearly in effect. Everyone was moving. Professionals becoming very efficient very suddenly. I was told to report to the barracks, which was covered under Rule 5, unexplained circumstances. Report to barracks, remain inside. Don't look out the windows. I followed the protocol. I went to the barracks, I stayed inside. I didn't look out the windows. Around me, other officers and technicians were doing the same thing. No one was talking about what we'd heard. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement that it hadn't happened, that the mysterious transmission had never come through, that the voice calling out, "I'm coming back down," was a hallucination we'd all shared simultaneously. We stayed in the barracks for 8 hours. At around 6 p.m., we were finally released. We were told to return to our regular duties. No explanation was given. No debrief was offered. The official story, which we learned hours later, was that the rocket had successfully launched had completed its mission and had returned to Earth safely. The first manned spaceflight, Yuri Gagarin, the hero of the Soviet Union, the man who changed history. But I knew something else had happened. Something that the official story didn't cover. Something that required evacuation protocols and radio blackouts and mandatory barracks confinement. I never found out who was in that capsule. Not in any official capacity. Not until decades later, when I read about the lost cosmonauts. Theories that there were other launches, other astronauts, other men and women who went up before Gagarin and never came back, or came back wrong. The academic world had dismissed it all as conspiracy, but I was there. I heard the transmission, and I understood in that moment that the protocols I'd been given weren't theoretical. They were proven procedures, tested methods for handling situations that the Soviet space program had encountered before I arrived, before April 1961, and they would encounter again.
After the April launch, the facility changed. The atmosphere became heavier, paranoid. There were additional security briefings, additional restrictions on movement. The barracks where I lived became more crowded. New staff arrived, scientists I'd never seen before, military specialists, engineers I didn't recognize, and all of them looked like they already knew something, like they'd been briefed on something I wasn't part of, like they understood the rules in a way that went beyond the manual. I started keeping a private journal. I know this was probably against regulations, likely illegal, but I needed to process what I'd witnessed. I needed to understand the protocols. So at night, in my small room, I wrote down observations, inconsistencies, fragments of conversations I overheard, things that didn't fit. One entry I made in late April read, "The maintenance tunnel door that was open on the 11th is sealed again, but there's a concrete plug on the outside. New concrete. You can see the color difference. They sealed something in, or sealed something out. The maintenance crew that worked on it never appeared in the facility log. I checked 3 times. Their names don't exist in our personnel records." Another entry from May 5th. "During the system check today, I was in Sector 7 when the countdown simulation started. I was counting doors per protocol. I counted 14 doors between the control room and the main observation corridor. But the architectural plans show 16 doors. 2 doors are missing from the official layout. Where are they? Are they sealed? Are they hidden? Why would you remove doors from the architectural records?" Another entry from May 23rd. "I heard my name called during a night shift around 11:30 p.m. I was in the secondary corridor heading back to the barracks. The voice came from the observation deck, clear as anything. Vladimir, just my name, repeated 3 times. I remembered rule 3. Do not respond. Do not pause. I kept walking, but I turned around once I reached the barracks, just to see if anyone was there. The observation deck was completely empty. The lights were off. No one was visible, but I could still hear the voice, very faintly, still calling my name. The frequency of these incidents increased. By June, they were happening multiple times a week. Not all of them were directly related to the protocols. Some of them were just operational anomalies. But collectively, they painted a picture of a facility that was dealing with something beyond normal scientific challenges. They were dealing with something that defied explanation. And then there was the second launch. It happened on August 6, 1961. Another R-7 modified vehicle, another test flight. But this time, we all knew what was happening. There was no doubt about it. This was a manned flight. There were extra guards around the flight operations building. There was a photographer present.
There was a level of official attention that made it clear this was significant. The protocol officer for this launch was a man named Dmitry Volkov. He'd been at the facility for about 5 months, longer than me. He was competent and quiet. He always followed procedures to the letter. I'd worked with him several times. He was one of the few people I considered a friend at that place. The launch happened at 11:43 a.m. From the moment the engines ignited, something felt wrong. The countdown had been delayed 3 times. Each time it was attributed to minor equipment verification. But delays had a cost. They built tension. They pushed back the timeline, and timeline, I was beginning to understand, was part of the protocol somehow. Timing mattered. When you did things mattered. This launch reached an altitude of 210 kilometers, which was higher than the April launch. The communications were clean, stable. The flight looked nominal. For 18 minutes, everything seemed perfect. And then, at the 18-minute mark, the transmissions started to change. The cosmonaut on board, they hadn't told us his name, began reporting visual anomalies, structural issues with the capsule, systems that were failing. And then he started describing things that didn't make physical sense. He said he could see mountains below him that weren't on any map. He said he could hear sounds from outside the capsule. Rhythmic sounds, mechanical sounds, like machinery. He asked permission to investigate. He asked what the sounds were. He sounded confused, almost panicked. The control room ordered him to focus on re-entry procedures, to ignore the distractions, to begin the sequence for coming back down. But the cosmonaut said he couldn't. He said the windows were showing him something that he couldn't ignore, something that he couldn't explain. And he needed to understand it before he came back. He needed to go higher. He needed to see more.
That's when the chief controller activated the protocols. The evacuation alarm sounded, just like it had in April, and everyone knew what to do. We'd trained for this. We'd experienced it. We knew the rhythm. Get to the barracks. Lock the doors. Don't look out the windows. Wait it out. But Dmitry Volkov did something different. I was with him when the alarm sounded. We were in the corridor together, heading toward the barracks, and when the alarm hit, everyone started moving with urgency. Everyone except Dmitry. He stopped. He looked at me, and he said something I'll never forget. "I'm going back to my room. I left something there. I'll meet you at the barracks." "Come on," I said. "We need to go, now. I need to get something. My papers, important papers. I'll be right behind you." "The protocols." "I've been here longer than you," he said. "I know the protocols. Go, I'll be fine." So I left him there. I followed the standard procedure. I went to the barracks with everyone else. I sat in that crowded room with 30 other people, all of us avoiding eye contact, all of us pretending that nothing unusual was happening, all of us following the rule that you don't acknowledge what's really going on. When the all clear sounded, 3 hours later, I immediately thought about Dmitry. I looked around the room. He wasn't there. None of us had seen him. We assumed he'd gone to a different barracks section, or maybe he'd gotten held up somewhere. Maybe he was dealing with administrative stuff. That's what we told ourselves. But Dmitry Volkov was never seen again. The next morning, there was a memo. All personnel were to report for a facilities audit, ID checks at every station, inventory verification. Nothing unusual about that. It was a standard procedure that happened maybe twice a year, but the tone was different. The mood was tense. And by the end of the day, it became clear that something had happened during the evacuation. Someone was missing, and the facility was conducting a manhunt disguised as a routine audit.
They never found him, not officially. His bunk was emptied of his belongings, his personnel file was marked transfer, reassignment, and his name was never mentioned again. It was as if Dmitry Volkov had simply ceased to exist. He'd been erased, not killed, not transferred, just erased from the official record in a way that was far more efficient than any bullet. I understood then what the protocols were really for. They weren't just procedures for emergencies. They were procedures for situations where reality itself became unreliable, where the normal rules of physics or logic or causality didn't apply, where the space program was encountering things that they couldn't explain through official channels, and they needed people to simply follow the procedures without understanding them, because understanding them might be worse than not understanding at all. After Dmitry disappeared, I became very careful about following the protocols exactly, not approximately, not reasonably, exactly. Every single word, every single implication. I treated the laminated card like a religious text. I kept it in my pocket at all times. I reviewed it daily. I started writing expanded notes in my personal journal, trying to decode what each rule really meant. Rule 4, about the maintenance tunnels, suddenly became very relevant because my new assignment involved regular tunnel access. I was assigned to transport classified documents between the main control complex and the secondary data processing center. These two buildings were connected by a tunnel system that ran beneath the facility. The tunnels were modern, concrete, well-lit, temperature-controlled, but according to the architectural plans I could see, they also contained sections that were far older, sections that predated the Soviet space program, sections that suggested this facility had been built on top of something else. I started keeping detailed count of the doors like the protocol specified. I went through the tunnels twice a day, every day, for 3 weeks, and I kept meticulous records in my journal. First route, 14 doors from the control building to checkpoint B. Second route, 12 doors from checkpoint B to the data center. Always the same, always consistent. And then, on September 3rd, I counted 16 doors. I remember stopping in the middle of the tunnel. My hands were shaking. I'd counted wrong. Obviously, that's what I told myself. So I turned around and walked back to the beginning and counted again, 16 doors. I counted a third time, 16. The extra 2 doors had appeared overnight. They were sealed, concrete block, very new, very obviously added in the last 24 hours. Per the protocol, discrepancies in door count may indicate structural changes or spatial inconsistencies. Report any anomalies immediately. So I reported it. I went to my supervisor, Colonel Yashin, and told him about the discrepancy. His response was interesting. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look alarmed. He looked like he'd been waiting for me to say something. He looked like he already knew about the doors. He told me that the extra doors were part of a structural reinforcement project. They were temporary seals. They would be removed after the next scheduled launch, and I was to say nothing about them to no one. He said that security clearance information wasn't being shared with everyone yet, and the doors were part of a need-to-know situation. I had just been moved up to the right level of need-to-know. I should consider it a compliment. It didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a threat. But I nodded and said I understood. What it meant, I later realized, was that the facility was conducting experiments that required them to seal off certain sections, and they were being honest about it in a limited way. They were just also implying that if I talked about it, there would be consequences. The kind of consequences that had befallen Dmitri. The kind of consequences that resulted in your name being erased from records.
In mid-September, a third launch was scheduled. This time, there was less secrecy about it. The official announcement came through proper channels. Another manned flight, another R-7 vehicle, another test of the new guidance systems. But everyone knew the truth. The space program was accelerating their schedule. They were launching rapidly, and with each launch, something was happening that required evacuation protocols and barracks confinement. This launch happened on September 18th at 10:15 a.m. I was in the control room again, performing my regular duties as a message runner, and I was watching the monitors very carefully, trying to understand what was happening, trying to see if there was a pattern. This flight went smoothly, too smoothly. The transmissions from the cosmonaut were calm, professional, perfect, almost scripted now that I think back on it. 26 minutes into the flight, he reported nominal conditions across all systems. Then they initiated the automatic re-entry sequence, and the rocket came back down. It landed successfully. The re-entry vehicle was recovered within 4 hours. The cosmonaut was extracted and taken to the medical bay for evaluation. Everything was proceeding normally, according to protocol. No evacuation was needed, no barracks confinement. This one had worked. Whatever it was they were testing, it had functioned correctly. But I was in the hallway outside the medical bay about an hour after the recovery, and I saw something that changed my understanding of what was really happening at this facility. I saw the cosmonaut being taken out on a stretcher. He was wrapped in a medical blanket. They were being extremely careful with him, very careful, almost like he was made of glass, almost like he might break at any moment. But it wasn't the careful handling that struck me. It was his face, his expression. He looked terrified, but not terrified in the way you'd expect from someone who just experienced extreme G-forces and re-entry heat. This was a different kind of terror. This was the expression of someone who'd seen something that their brain couldn't process. Someone who'd experienced something that fundamentally altered their understanding of reality. And he was whispering something repeatedly. I was close enough to hear fragments of it. He kept saying, "They're watching. They're still watching. They followed us back. They followed me back." Who was watching? Who had followed him back? These were the questions I couldn't answer, but the fear in his voice suggested that whatever had happened up there, whatever he'd seen in those 26 minutes of spaceflight, it had proven something. It had validated something. And that something was why the protocols existed. By October 1961, the pattern of my days at the facility had become ritualistic. Wake up, perform duties, follow protocols, sleep, repeat. The protocols had become more ingrained in my behavior. I was following them automatically now, not consciously thinking about them. Just moving through my days while adhering to a set of rules that protected me from consequences I didn't fully understand. October brought colder weather to the Kazakhstan desert. The nights dropped below freezing. The facility seemed to feel smaller in the darkness. The corridors felt longer, and the sense of something being fundamentally wrong with this place became almost palpable. It was on a night in late October when I had my first direct encounter with the things that the protocols were designed to protect us from. I was working the night shift, transporting documents from the night operations center
to secure storage. It was around 1:30 a.m. The facility was quieter at that hour. Fewer people awake, fewer witnesses to what was really happening. I was in one of the residential corridors, heading back toward my quarters after making a delivery, when I heard my name being called. It came from an empty office. I could see the open doorway as I passed, and from inside that office, a man's voice called, "Vladimir, come here. I need to speak with you." I recognized the voice immediately. It was Dmitry Volkov, the man who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, the man who no longer existed in any official capacity. My hands went cold. My first instinct was to respond, to enter the office, to see if it was really him, to understand what had happened to him, and where he'd been, and why he was calling to me in the middle of the night. But Rule 3 came to mind immediately. If you hear your name called during an emergency or evacuation, do not respond, do not pause, do not acknowledge it. This wasn't technically an emergency or evacuation. This was just a voice in an empty office in the middle of the night, but the rule applied to the principle, something that could mimic Dimitri's voice, something that had learned how to call to me in a way that would make me stop, something that knew my name. So I didn't stop. I kept walking, but I was shaking. My heart was pounding, and from behind me, I heard the office door slam hard, like something had kicked it shut in anger. The voice was louder now, still calling my name, asking why I wouldn't respond, begging me to come back. I didn't look back. I reached my quarters. I locked the door, and I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, my radio playing low volume, following a modified version of Rule 4, despite being alone in my room. When morning came, I reported the incident to Colonel Yashin, just as the protocol instructed. He listened to my account without interrupting. When I finished, he simply nodded and said, "You did the right thing. Thank you for reporting it. Don't mention this to anyone else." That was it. No investigation, no explanation, no confirmation of whether what I heard was real or hallucination, just a dismissal and a return to regular duties. But things had changed for me at that point. I understood that Dmitry hadn't actually been transferred. He was still at the facility, or something that had been Dmitry was still at the facility, and it knew my name. It could mimic voices, it could lure people, and the protocols existed specifically to protect us from being lured away, from responding to calls that sounded like our friends, from approaching doors that opened to places we weren't meant to go.
2 nights later, I was in the tunnel system again, performing my regular document delivery, and this time I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dust on the tunnel floor, multiple sets of footprints, coming from different directions, converging on one of the sealed doors, the ones with the concrete blocks. These footprints were fresh, probably from within the last day or two, and they led right to the sealed door, like someone or something had been standing there, had been pacing there, had been trying to get through. I reported this to Colonel Yashin as well, following the protocol, and again, he took the information with no visible reaction. "These tunnels have multiple access points," he said. "People come and go during their shifts. The footprints are probably nothing." But his eyes said something different. His eyes said he knew exactly who had been walking in that tunnel, and he knew what they'd been trying to do at that sealed door. In November, the facility received new administrative staff. A woman named Irina Volkov arrived as part of the Clerical Operations Division. I recognized the last name immediately. Volkov, Dimitri's sister, I later learned. She'd been transferred from another facility specifically to work at our installation. No one spoke about the connection. No one acknowledged it.
but it was clear that she'd been moved here for a reason. I suspected that she'd been brought here to observe, to be close to whatever had happened to her brother, to understand what this facility was really doing. I made a point of not speaking to her. Following the protocols meant limiting unnecessary associations. It meant staying invisible. It meant not asking questions that might draw attention from the people who ran this place and knew secrets that I wasn't supposed to know. But I noticed Irina. I watched her from a distance, and I saw the exact moment when she began to understand what this facility was. It was written all over her face. The horror, the recognition, the realization that her brother was gone and had never been transferred and was still here somewhere, but as something other than human, something that could mimic his voice in empty offices in the middle of the night. I never spoke to her about it, but I think she knew I understood. And I think she understood that understanding this meant you couldn't leave. You were bound to this place by the knowledge itself.
December 1961 brought the facility to a kind of culmination. There was an urgency to the operations that I'd never experienced before. Launches were being scheduled, then canceled, then rescheduled. The staff was being cycled through briefings that I wasn't allowed to attend. Scientists from Moscow arrived and left within days. Something was happening, something that was being prepared for. And then the order came down. All protocols were being updated. New versions, amendments, additional rules. A memo circulated that stated all personnel were to report to mandatory briefing sessions where the protocols would be reviewed and updated. This was unprecedented. The protocols had been static since I'd arrived. This meant something fundamental had changed. The briefing was conducted by General Lebedev, who I'd rarely seen before. He was a high-ranking military officer from Moscow, someone with access to the very top of the Soviet command structure. He stood at the front of the room with the updated protocols printed on laminated cards, hundreds of them stacked on a table beside him. "Recent operational events," he began, "have necessitated an expansion of our safety protocols. These additions will maintain operational security and personnel safety during the next phase of our testing program. You will memorize these protocols. You will follow them exactly. Deviation will result in immediate reassignment and official sanctions." He then read the additional protocols. There were 3 of them. New rules, new requirements. New Protocol 7 stated, "If you observe personnel moving between restricted areas outside of scheduled maintenance windows, do not report to standard supervisors. Instead, use the secure communication line provided in your packet. This bypasses normal reporting channels to ensure critical information reaches the appropriate level of command immediately." What this meant, I understood, was that there were unauthorized movements happening, things that weren't being reported through normal channels, things that required special direct reporting, things that the regular supervisory structure shouldn't know about, because the regular supervisory structure wasn't equipped to handle them. New Protocol 8 stated, "Effective immediately, all personnel are to be relocated according to the housing assignments provided. These new assignments will separate personnel by security clearance level and operational function. This is necessary for the implementation of Procedure 12 beginning in January 1962. Personnel changes will be final and no exceptions will be granted." We were being reorganized, separated, presumably so that people with critical knowledge would be isolated from each other, so information couldn't be shared, so individual people couldn't corroborate stories or compare notes about what was really happening here. And New Protocol 9, which was the one that everything had been building toward, stated, "Between January 1st and January 8th, 1962, the facility will undergo a complete site-wide diagnostic and isolation procedure.
All personnel will be confined to designated quarters, all exits will be sealed, all communication with the outside world will be suspended. No exceptions, no emergencies, complete isolation. Duration of isolation, 7 days. Purpose, system validation and confirmation procedures. 7 days. Complete isolation. All exits sealed. At that point, I understood that whatever they'd been testing, whatever they'd been observing, whatever the launch anomalies and the evacuations and the protocols had been preparing for, it was culminating in January. And everyone who worked here had been selected specifically because we either already knew too much to be let go, or we were about to know too much to ever leave. After the briefing, I sat in my quarters and considered my options. I could attempt to escape, but the facility was in a remote desert region with military checkpoints. I could attempt to report what was happening to someone on the outside, but I had no way to make that report that wouldn't be intercepted. Or I could follow the protocols, stay invisible, survive January. I chose option 3. I was young, I was scared, and I was already so deep into this that walking away seemed less viable than going forward. The month leading up to January passed in a haze. The facility continued operating. Launches continued, but the atmosphere was different now. Everyone knew something was coming. Everyone understood that the ground rules had changed. People who'd been friendly became distant. People who'd been chatty became silent. Everyone was preparing psychologically for the isolation. On December 28th, I was reassigned to a new housing unit, a small building that housed 12 people, according to the new security clearance separation protocol. Among the 12 was Irina Volkova. We were placed in adjacent quarters. She knew who I was. She knew that I knew what had happened to her brother. And in that moment, our eyes met when we were being shown to our new rooms, and there was an unspoken acknowledgement that we were going to face January together, that we were going to experience whatever Procedure 12 actually was together, and that we would either both survive it or we would both become like Dmitri, disappeared from official records, but still present in the facility, still calling out names in empty offices in the middle of the night. January 1st arrived. The entire facility went into full lockdown. The outer gates were sealed. The communication antennas were taken offline. We were cut off from the world. 12 of us in a small building. Nothing to do but follow the protocols and wait and wonder what would happen next. And then on the night of January 3rd, at approximately 2:30 a.m., every alarm in the facility sounded simultaneously. Not an evacuation alarm, not a launch abort alarm, a different alarm, one I'd never heard before, a sound that seemed to cut through the air like a blade. From our quarters, I could hear movement everywhere, running footsteps, vehicles, shouting in the distance. But we were under strict order. During the isolation period, personnel were not to leave their assigned quarters under any circumstances. We were to stay inside. We were to remain calm. We were to wait for instructions. So I stayed, and Irina stayed in her adjacent room, and the other 10 in our building stayed in theirs, and we all listened to the sounds of the facility descending into chaos. We listened to something happening that the protocols hadn't prepared us for. Because the protocols, I realized, had always been about managing things that had already been anticipated. But something new was happening, something that the facility's leadership hadn't expected. I heard the sound of the sealed tunnel doors being breached from somewhere deep beneath the facility. I heard things moving through those tunnels. I heard sounds that didn't sound like machinery. I heard sounds that suggested something large and purposeful and intelligent moving through the darkness below us.
And I heard voices, not calling my name, just voices, multiple voices, layered over each other, speaking in languages I didn't recognize, speaking to each other, arguing, agreeing, making decisions about something.
At 4:17 a.m., exactly 3 days into our 7-day isolation, an emergency siren sounded. This was followed by an evacuation alert. Not following the normal protocols, a direct voice broadcast that told us to proceed immediately to the emergency transport vehicles parked outside the facility. We had 5 minutes, then the vehicles would depart with or without us. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my emergency pack. I pounded on Irina's door. She opened it, already dressed, already prepared, already moving. We didn't speak. We ran. Outside, there was chaos. Not the controlled chaos of a practiced evacuation. Real chaos. Genuine emergency. Military vehicles, helicopters, scientists and soldiers running in every direction. And the sky was illuminated by something, a light that came from beneath the ground. A pulsing red and blue light that suggested something massive was rising. I didn't look back. Rule 2, never look back at the launch tower. Never look back at the facility. I kept my eyes forward. I ran toward the transport vehicles. Irina was beside me. We reached the last vehicle just as it was being sealed. We were pulled aboard by a soldier who didn't ask questions, didn't check credentials, just grabbed us and threw us inside. The vehicle accelerated before the doors were completely sealed. We were moving, away from the facility, away from the light, away from whatever had been sealed beneath Baikonur for decades, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The journey took 6 hours. We were in a military transport truck with 30 other evacuees. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. Everyone was in shock. Everyone was processing what had just happened. When we finally arrived at a secondary military facility about 400 kilometers away, we were separated. I never saw Irina again after that moment. I was debriefed for 3 days by military intelligence officers. I was told that the evacuation was standard procedure, that nothing unusual had occurred, that I was to report for reassignment to a different project, that any discussion of the last 4 months would result in criminal sanctions under military security law. I was transferred to a space navigation project in the Caucasus region. I spent the remaining years of my service there. I completed my military obligation. I never returned to Baikonur, and for decades I didn't speak about any of it. The protocols had worked. They had saved me by following them, and they had saved me after the evacuation by continuing to follow them, by not asking questions, by not speaking about what I'd experienced, by not trying to expose what the Soviet space program had found beneath the Kazakhstan desert. But now, in the twilight of my life, with the Soviet Union dissolved and the Cold War ended and the facility decommissioned and declassified documents trickling into the public record, I'm finally breaking the silence. Not to cause harm, not to embarrass the program or the military, but to explain why the protocols existed. Because they saved lives, because they recognized that there were things in this universe that defied explanation and couldn't be managed through normal procedures, and because the men and women who developed those protocols understood something fundamental. Sometimes the only way to survive the unknowable is to follow the rules, even when you don't understand why those rules exist. The protocols kept me alive. They kept Irina alive. And they kept the facility from descending into total catastrophe when whatever was beneath the ground finally found the right moment to emerge. I never learned what was beneath Baikonur. I never learned what came up from those tunnels. I never learned what happened to Dmitry Volkov or to the other people who disappeared from official records. But I learned something more valuable than answers. I learned that some mysteries are supposed to remain mysteries, and that following the protocol, The rules that are established for reasons you don't understand is sometimes the only way to survive when you encounter something that should not exist. That's what I was at that top-secret rocket testing range in Kazakhstan in 1961. I was a man following protocols, and the protocols saved my life.